It started with a smell so awful it could wake the dead. At first, I thought something had crawled under my house and died. But as I followed the rancid stench, I discovered something far worse. My backyard had been turned into the neighborhood's personal sewage dump, and the culprits? None other than the power-hungry HOA, who had rerouted their entire drainage system straight into my land, without permission. They thought they could get away with it. They thought I'd just adjust. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It started when I saw a slow-moving river of brown sludge creeping from beneath my fence like some unholy horror, pooling onto my once pristine lawn. My stomach flipped as I traced its source. A pipe, freshly installed, sticking out of the ground like a middle finger aimed directly at me. It took my brain a second to process what I was looking at. A sewage drain on my property, and it was actively spewing out the foulest cocktail of waste I had ever seen. My first reaction was denial. Surely this was a mistake, a city error, a random plumbing disaster that had, by sheer cosmic misfortune, landed in my yard. But as I followed the pipe back, my confusion turned into horror, then rage. The line led straight to the HOA's main drainage system. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Those corrupt, self-important, power-hungry morons had rerouted their entire system directly into my property, without warning, without permission. They had turned my backyard into the community's toilet. A sharp, bubbling rage built in my chest as I whipped out my phone and stormed toward the HOA office. I wasn't a man prone to violence, but at that moment, I briefly considered whether shoving a certain HOA president headfirst into that sewage river would be legally justifiable. The HOA had always been a thorn in my side, issuing fines for the color of my mailbox, enforcing ridiculous rules about the lawn height limit, and breathing down my neck like a bunch of power-drunk vultures. But this was a new level of villainy. By the time I reached the HOA building, my hands were shaking with anger. I burst through the doors, the stench still clinging to my clothes, and locked eyes with the woman I had come to loathe more than the smell of raw sewage itself. Barbara Reynolds, the HOA president. She sat behind a polished mahogany desk, sipping tea with the smug satisfaction of a dictator who had just passed a law outlawing happiness. "Jack," she greeted, not even bothering to look up. "If this is about your latest violation, I really don't have time for you. You rerouted the entire neighborhood's sewage drain into my property." I didn't shout, but my voice carried the weight of a man who had just found. His backyard was now a literal biohazard. Barbara finally looked up, an expression of mild boredom on her face. She set her tea down and folded her hands neatly on her desk, as if we were discussing a minor inconvenience. "We had to make some infrastructure changes. Your property was the most strategic location for the redirection." I stared at her, my brain short-circuiting. "You dumped human waste onto my land and didn't think to ask?" She sighed, exasperated, like a mother dealing with a particularly dim-witted child. "Jack, we don't need permission for a city-approved project. The board agreed it was necessary for the greater good of the neighborhood. Surely you can understand that." "The greater good?" I clenched my fist. "Barbara, my backyard looks like a crime scene from a horror movie. Do you have any idea what that smell is doing to my life? I can't even open my windows without my house smelling like a backed-up porta-potty." Barbara gave me a tight-lipped smile. "I'd advise you to simply adjust. The decision is final." Adjust? My lawn had turned into a septic tank, and she was telling me to adjust? The pure audacity of it nearly gave me an aneurysm. "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Barbara's smile widened, shark-like. "Then I'm afraid you'll be facing some hefty fines interfering with the HOA-approved project." She slid a pink slip across the desk, one I recognized all too well. "And let's not forget," she added sweetly, "complaints against the HOA without cause are also subject to penalties." That was the moment I realized Barbara wasn't just a bureaucratic tyrant. She was a full-blown supervillain. She had backed me into a corner, made sure I had no way out. If I fought her, I'd be buried under so many fines and legal battles, I'd need a lifelong attorney just to keep my house. If I let it slide, I'd be spending the rest of my days living in a toxic waste zone. I stood there, fists clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms, my rage bubbling hotter than the literal sewage now fermenting in my backyard. And then something inside me snapped. Fine, if this was how they wanted to play. If the HOA thought they could drown me in their filth and get away with it, then I'd just have to return the favor. But I wasn't going to fight them with complaints or legal threats. No, that would be too easy to squash. I was going to fight them on their level with a plan. A very dirty, very satisfying plan. I picked up the fine slip and gave Barbara a smile of my own, one that must have looked downright unsettling, given the flicker of unease that crossed her face. "You're right, Barbara," I said smoothly. "I should adjust. I'll figure something out." She studied me warily. "Good," she said, though there was a slight hesitation now. I turned, walking out of the office, my mind already racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I had an advantage Barbara didn't know about. I had resources, skills, and most importantly, an unshakable desire for revenge. Just going to fix this mess. I was going to make sure the entire neighborhood paid the price for siding with the HOA, and I knew exactly where I was going to start. Jack spent the rest of the day gathering information, scouring through old blueprints of the neighborhood's plumbing system. His anger burned bright, but he knew that rage alone wouldn't be enough if he wanted real revenge, the kind that sent a message. He needed precision. The HOA had turned his property into a septic disaster, and the only logical response was to return the favor in a way they'd never forget. Late that night, under the dim glow of his garage light, Jack pored over every possible schematic he could find. He traced the routes of pipes, looked at how the drainage flowed, and then, like a beacon from the heavens, he saw it, the perfect flaw in their system. The HOA's main filtration system for their beloved community pool was directly connected to a central pipeline that could, with just the right adjustments, be rerouted just like they had done to him. If he played this right, their next big neighborhood pool party was going to be an event for the history books. The only problem was execution. He needed supplies, a way to access the pipes without drawing attention, and most importantly, he needed to cover his tracks. If Barbara even sniffed the possibility of sabotage, she'd unleash HOA hellfire on him in the form of lawsuits, fines, and probably a restraining order for disrupting neighborhood harmony. He couldn't just waltz in with a shovel and start digging, so he had to be careful. For the next 2 days, Jack played the role of the defeated homeowner, making just enough noise to keep Barbara convinced he was harmless. He let her think she had won. He even made a point to wave at her during one of her ridiculous early morning HOA patrols, where she paraded through the neighborhood pretending to care about landscaping violations. The smug look on her face nearly made him abandon his plan and just dump raw sewage onto her car instead. But no, he had something much grander in mind. At night, he worked. He carefully dug a concealed trench behind his property, one that connected perfectly to the underground system that fed into the HOA's filtration line. It took hours of painstaking labor, but with a little bit of elbow grease and some well-placed PVC piping, the system was ready. All he needed now was the moment of truth. The opportunity arrived in the form of an announcement plastered across the neighborhood bulletin board. The HOA was hosting their annual Summer Splash pool party. It was their biggest event of the season, where Barbara and her cronies flaunted their superiority, charged absurd entry fees, and sipped overpriced cocktails while the rest of the neighborhood acted like they actually enjoyed being under HOA rule. It was the kind of event where Barbara gave long-winded speeches about community unity, while subtly reminding everyone that any resistance to her reign would result in punishment. Jack smirked as he read the flyer. It was happening in 3 days. That was perfect. He could make the final adjustments the night before and ensure that everything was set for the ultimate unveiling. When the night came, Jack worked in near silence, making sure every detail was executed with perfection. He fitted the last segment of piping, tested the connection, and when he was sure it would work, he covered his tracks meticulously. By the time the sun started to rise, the job was done. Now it was only a matter of waiting. The day of the party arrived, and Jack played it cool, acting like any other disinterested neighbor, as people began filing toward the pristine blue waters of the HOA's most prized possession, the community pool. The decorations were excessive as always, with white and gold banners hanging around the fences, expensive catering lined up on tables, and HOA board members dressed like they were hosting a Hollywood gala instead of a suburban pool party. The whole event reeked of self-importance, and Jack took a seat on his porch with a cold drink in hand, waiting for the magic moment. The guests began to pile in, kids laughing as they ran toward the water, parents chatting over their expensive drinks, and Barbara herself standing near the pool in an obnoxious floral sundress. Clearly enjoyed her reign as queen of the HOA kingdom. She basked in the attention, greeting people with her signature smugness, completely unaware that her empire was about to suffer a catastrophic collapse. Jack checked his watch. Right on schedule. The first screams came almost instantly. A man who had just leaped into the water's surface with a look of pure horror on his face, his arms flailing as he scrambled to get out. Another woman shrieked as she stepped into the shallow end, recoiling as though she had stepped into lava. And then it happened. The water darkened, the once crystal-clear pool turning into a nightmare of brown filth. It spread rapidly. The foul, unmistakable scent of raw sewage filling the air like a toxic bomb had been dropped in the center of the party. Guests scrambled in sheer panic, tripping over each other, pushing, slipping, and falling back into the very water they were desperately trying to escape. The screams turned into chaos, pure unfiltered horror, as people realized exactly what was floating beside them. Barbara, standing on the edge of the pool, had gone pale. Jack watched with absolute delight as she stepped back, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, unable to comprehend the absolute disaster unfolding before her. She turned to one of her board members, a man who had built his entire personality around enforcing HOA parking violations, and screeched, "What the hell is happening?" The man, whose face had turned green from either the smell or sheer disgust, stammered, "The filtration system. It's backing up into the—" Barbara's face twisted in horror. As she finally put two and two together, she whipped her head around, eyes scanning the crowd, searching for someone to blame. That's when her gaze landed on Jack. He raised his glass in a silent toast. Barbara's expression shifted from horror to unfiltered rage, her hands clenching into fists as she stormed toward him. She was dripping in sweat, her pristine sundress now stained with the splashback of contaminated water from panicked partygoers. "You," she hissed, voice low and seething, "you did this." Jack took a slow sip of his drink, letting the moment sink in. "Barbara," he said coolly, "I'm just adjusting like you suggested." The sound of sirens cut through the chaos. The HOA, in its infinite arrogance, had hired off-duty security to monitor the event. Now, instead of keeping watch for party crashers, they were being flooded with complaints, accusations, and demands to fix the situation immediately. Barbara's fury reached a boiling point, her face flushing red as she jabbed a finger at Jack. "This isn't over," she spat. "I will find proof." A wet splatter interrupted her rant as someone from the pool flung a handful of contaminated water in frustration, unintentionally hitting Barbara square in the chest. The entire party, which had already dissolved into madness, somehow managed to get even worse. Jack, satisfied beyond measure, stood up, stretched, and turned toward his house, leaving the HOA to deal with the consequences of their own filthy decisions. The beauty of it all was that he had covered his tracks, so well that even if Barbara suspected him, she had no proof. The only thing left now was to sit back and watch as the consequences flushed through the entire HOA. Barbara was livid. Jack could practically feel her burning gaze from across the neighborhood as she stomped around in the aftermath of the worst disaster the HOA had ever seen. The pool was unsalvageable. The smell alone had embedded itself so deeply into the ground that even after the water was drained, the stench of raw sewage clung to the area like a curse. People were demanding refunds for the party. HOA board members were turning on each other, and Barbara had completely lost the iron grip she once held over the neighborhood. Jack, on the other hand, had never felt more at peace. The oppressive weight of the HOA had been lifted, at least temporarily, and the satisfaction of seeing Barbara drenched in contaminated pool water had been worth every ounce of effort. But he wasn't stupid. He knew Barbara wouldn't let this go. She was the type of person who thrived on control, and when control slipped through her fingers, she became dangerous. Sure enough, within 24 hours, Jack received his first official accusation. A formal notice was taped to his door, a bright pink slip with Barbara's signature scrawled across the bottom. It stated, in the most condescending legal jargon possible, that he was under investigation for acts of environmental sabotage and malicious intent. Silence filled the courtroom by the time the verdict was handed down. Barbara looked like she had swallowed a lemon. The HLA was found liable for damages, and they were ordered to pay Jack a hefty settlement. The sewage system had to be completely repaired, and Barbara herself was stripped of her position as HLA president. Jack wasn't one to gloat, but when he walked out of that courtroom, he made sure to smile and wave at Barbara as she sat slack-jawed in the defendant's seat. The fallout was beautiful. The HLA board scrambled to salvage their reputation, but the damage had been done. Residents, emboldened by Barbara's downfall, demanded changes. Fines were overturned. Ridiculous rules were repealed, and Jack became a sort of local legend, the man who had finally stood up to the tyranny of the HLA. Barbara, of course, refused to go down quietly. She tried, in the most pathetic ways possible, to seek revenge. She sent passive-aggressive letters, tried to have Jack banned from community events, and even attempted to get his lawn inspected daily for violations. But it was all meaningless. She had lost her power, and she knew it. Jack, on the other hand, took his settlement money and made a few upgrades to his home, starting with a brand new top-of-the-line security system, just in case Barbara got any more ideas. He also replaced his lawn, not just restoring it, but making it even greener and more pristine than before. In the end, the HOA learned a valuable lesson: never mess with a guy who knows how to reroute a sewage system. Their precious pool party turned into a nightmare. Their reputation was ruined, and their iron grip over the neighborhood finally crumbled. Barbara, the queen of HOA tyranny, tried to fight back, but she had lost everything. Fines were overturned, rules were repealed, and I walked away with a hefty settlement. And best of all, the smell of raw sewage was finally gone, from my property at least. Revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it just needs the right flow,